questions about anything before we get into...
I do. No one else does. Go ahead. If you can incorporate some discussion of borderline personality disorder, or borderline, what is a borderline personality?
Well, I don't usually deal with diagnostics simply because we're not doing therapy with diagnosis. You're doing therapy with an individual. You're under the assumption that therapy is different as a function of a different diagnosis.
Well, just what the diagnosis, what sort of what it applies to.
Okay, I can deal with that individually with you without taking time to discuss therapy.
Okay.
Even though I have a book out, I'm dealing with therapy with specific disorders. That's not really an appropriate way to go. The assumption being that a specific kind of therapy is involved with a specific kind of disorder. Many people operate under that assumption, and it just isn't so. We don't do therapy with specific disorders. The essential aspect of psychotherapy is the understanding of the particular pathology in the individual. Certainly some things are characteristic of different disorders. And you want to be sensitive to what those characteristics are. But it's a mistake to think therapy in terms of a process that takes time. I think that's the discussion we had at the end of last session, that somehow you envision therapy as a process that takes time in order to accomplish particular kinds of ends. That's a very fair assumption to make until we understand differently. And that therefore different diagnoses require different kinds of therapy because they are supposed to be different kinds of disorders. What I would like to suggest to you just quickly to help you to understand that there is something very special that goes on in a therapy process, which very few of us ever accomplish. That the revealing is the healing, I put simple terms like that. That is the spontaneous understanding and acceptance of what has been rejected in oneself. When the client sees that, is an immediate healing effect, a unifying effect, integrative effect, self-accepting effect. And what I want to suggest to you, although I won't probably have the time to discuss it in much depth, it will take a lot of preparation for me to help you to understand it. But that the essential healing effect of therapy takes place in timelessness. What I mean by that is it takes place out of a state of communion. I'll try to just briefly explain what I mean by that as the essence of the therapeutic relationship and the essence of the therapeutic process. It's really quite an astounding thing. Now, you have your understanding that therapy takes a lot of time because specific kinds of things have to be accomplished. What I'm suggesting to you is that when the therapist is in a state of communion with the client, that means a state of subject-object non-duality, where there's no sense of psychological separatedness between the two. I may have mentioned once before, where you listen to me talk, but you're also reacting to what I'm saying, and you're pretty much conscious of yourself, as well as partially conscious of me. In the state of communion, when you're giving over to the client the totality of your conscious awareness and of your feeling energy, so that you're not really wanting anything other than to be totally attuned to the client this moment. In that state of communion, where you become totally empty of any subjectivity taking place in yourself, you are totally in communion with the client's subjectivity. You will hear the rejected feeling in the client. It will just come to you very spontaneously. And it will pop up here. Now the miraculous thing, and I call it miraculous because it's very difficult to understand, is that in most occasions, when it occurs spontaneously to you here, it will occur to the client spontaneously at the same time. Why? Because in reality, there is no real boundedness or separatedness between psyches.
You're saying there's no ego boundary?
there are ego sense of self boundaries that come from self-consciousness. But in terms of the psyches themselves, in terms of the psychological part of your being, there is one infinite wholeness in which we are all immersed. So there's no real boundary. That's what makes empathy possible, love relationship, or communion really possible, where it's possible for you to give over your awareness totally to the other. In most cases, we have this ego sense of finite boundedness because we have this finite subjectivity of which we become self-conscious and therefore break off our connectedness, our natural connectedness to the other individual. Naturally, when there's no self-consciousness, your conscious awareness is like a light that shines away from yourself, totally to the other. That's the natural process. It is unnatural for you to create a sense of subjectivity that makes you recoil your conscious awareness back upon yourself. That creates a false sense of subject-object duality or separatedness.
How would you distinguish the unhealthy loss of ego boundaries, say it might happen with somebody with a borderline disorder, from what you're talking about?
Yes, first of all, that's a presumption that isn't true. That the the pathological individual, no matter how pathological, does not lose ego boundaries, but actually is reinforcing ego boundaries, is very much more self-conscious, narcissistically more self-absorbed and self-conscious, and much more feels like a finite separated being, is lost in their own subjectivity, to the point when you become psychotic, you are totally absorbed in that subjectivity and not contact with reality at all. I understand the terminology that says there's a distortion or loss of ego boundaries. You have to explore that very carefully to see what they really mean by that. What? Yes.
In the way you have things up there, how would you explain the step from going from, say, insight to acceptance? I mean, oftentimes you're in the client, and I mean, like the insight is there at some level, but there's no real acceptance yet.
Yes. There's a difference between this insight coming suddenly and spontaneously to the conscious awareness of the client versus you're giving it intellectually to the client, and the client tries to decide whether to accept it, you see. But that's only tolerating it. It's not acceptance of it. Acceptance is unconditional and involves no value judgment of good or bad. And I'll discuss that with you also if you're interested. In this process, the client may see the truth and try to reject it again, but I find that in most cases, when I hear the truth in that state of communion, that the client has heard it too at some level. They may reject it, I may communicate it from here to here. I'll give you an example of that, but the client hears it. It happened just a couple of weeks ago. A relative came to see me. We were just chatting about his problem with authority. And as he was talking about justifying his anger toward authority and enjoying ridiculing authority figures, as I was in a state of communion with him and listened to it, this is without logical deduction, spontaneously arose to me the insight that he was hostile to authority figures because he really could not forgive himself for being weak and submissive to an authority figure earlier in his life. He just couldn't forgive himself for being scared of the authority figure that abused him. And he surrendered and could never accept himself because of that. And therefore have to try to get even with all authority figures. That's not something that's a matter of logical deduction that takes time. This is something that happens timelessly. It just occurs spontaneously. And the moment I heard it, he became silent. And so I shared with him what I heard. And he said, yes, I know, I heard it too. It's really an incredible thing. And he said, of course, that's right. It's almost like you can't be in a situation where you accept or reject that truth. It becomes so apparently the truth and comes to you so suddenly that you're not in a position to really accept it or reject it. It just clearly is the truth. Now, it may be painful. You may still distort it in some way, rationalize it and justify it. But I find in very few cases is that true. Not when it arises that way. It's just too blatantly the truth. It has been there. We know that it is there. All of you have something within yourself at some level. You know it is the truth. You tell yourself what you want to be true. You tell yourself what you want to believe. But on a different level, it is there. And you know that it is there. Maybe that's fully consciously. But when it comes up, or if I say it to you, because at some level it has come up, then you can't deny it anymore. Then I can be in a position of helping you deal with why it's so difficult to accept and why you're struggling dealing with it and accepting it. What I'm saying is therapy happens very, very quickly, in a timeless manner. So if I'm in the position of trying to sell you something, of logically trying to intellectually make you see the truth of what I'm saying, that's often a difficult problem because it becomes then a battle of wills in which you see me as imposing my truth and my will upon you, and you tend to resist it even if it is true just because it's my truth and it's not your truth. When you see it for yourself, it is your truth. The fact is that when there's an overlap between us, when there's a state of communion, and I hear it, I find the client hears it simultaneously.
But only when there's communion happens.
Yes. That's the whole secret of psychotherapy. Without that, you're in a state of division, which is an egotistical state, and it's a pathological state, because the ego sense of separatedness is not a truth. You have to create it out of conceptual subjectivity. That happens to you sometime when you're in therapy. You hear something in the client, or something in you reacts to what you hear, you become self-conscious of what you react to, and you break off continued contact with the client and the flow of their experiential reality. So when I'm listening to the client in communion, my guts are feeling what's at the gut level of the client as my mind is hearing what's at the conscious level, what's coming out as thought. I'm hearing both at the same time. And in many instances, this comes up very quickly, and I hear what has been rejected, even before he's gotten to it. I can feel where he's going with it. At some level, he sees where he's going with it, whether it's conscious or subconscious. I'm there with him. It comes up to me. I hear where he's going with it. And I may just say that to him. I get the feeling that you're frightened of homosexuality. How the hell do you know that? I never said anything about that. Well, at some level, you did say something about that, and I heard it. That's what makes therapy very fast. Now, we could talk about this whole other issue of you see a truth, or at least you think you see a truth, logically deduced quite often, and you want to sell that to the client. And you're trying to sell it through the defensive system of the client, where they feel threatened in their ego as a function of this particular truth. I find that even if you're able to sell it to the client, quite often it's meaningless because it's stated only at the intellectual level. The experiential truth hasn't come up and be experienced. So therefore it has no healing effect. It's just an intellectual, cognitive integration, but it's not the therapeutic effect that involves the integration of that which has been truly rejected or separated from. That's the experiential truth, and the painfulness of it.
I can't somehow deal with the disparity between the simplicity of this process, although it has a complexity to it also, and then the apparent necessity for taking, all kinds of historical information and testing information.
Yeah,
and
I understand that.
I mean, but you would make a case for testing.
I'd make a case of testing for you, not for me. Because I have to try to teach you something about how you use testing to understand and so forth. You're supposed to understand. There are many things you have to understand. The whole basic thing you have to understand is that the therapeutic and assessment process is founded on time, which the ego is founded on. I'm saying to you that in a given moment in which you're totally present to the present, there is no sense of time. And that is the optimal contact with reality that is psychological health. That's a state of communion. It's optimal contact with reality, transcendence of the ego. And I'm saying that the way we function in psychotherapy is designed from the very beginning to reinforce the perpetuation of the ego. And therefore, our therapy has been basically an attempt to stay within ego confines and try to make the ego a little bit less negatively conceptualized and more positively conceptualized, but never to produce a real healing effect. That's why they moved away, I think, from the whole notion of psychological growth, because they know that growth involves outgrowing the immature fixations, otherwise you can't mature, and have just tried to devise forms of therapy which would deal pretty much up here at the cognitive and behavioral level, so that you can deal with pretty easily.
This requires a great deal of trust of the client, both for himself and his own experience, and also trust of the therapist and
your own experience.
So the time, I can understand that the actual therapeutic process occurs quickly, but that time of establishing that trust, and for the client to learn to trust themselves and their own experience after a lifetime of not trusting their experience, and then learning to trust another person, that would take time, or may take time.
Well, that trust isn't really necessary. If that truth comes up to the client, that's just the truth seen. That truth coming up does not necessarily involve his trusting me. I mean, he may have to trust me some to even communicate with me. You see, that may be true. But I think you'll find that it doesn't take very much communication in a state of communion for you to hear where the client is going, what they're feeling. Feeling is an energy thing, which you start to pick up in a state of communion. You start to pick up that energy and start to feel what it is that the feeling is that's being fought, resisted, or rejected. So, no, I don't think trust takes time either.
But a lot of clients don't trust their own experience. Through their whole lifetime, that's one of the reasons they're in the state they're in. They've learned that what was obvious to them is not real, because that's...
Well, in many cases, that's been a conditioned insensitivity, because what has been real in them has been very painful. So they condition an insensitivity not to trust and be aware. You see, but at some level, they know what the truth is, and when that truth becomes apparent to them, they know what that truth is, because they have examined it for a long time, not just in that moment. And when that truth comes up, it just sits right, like the gentleman who recognized during every authority battle that he's had that at some level he was despising himself and being a gutless coward. And he was trying to undo that humiliation by trying to humiliate authority figures. At some level, when we're doing that, at some level we know what we're doing, but not fully consciously. And so when that comes up from within himself, it could not be denied. I mean, I can reinforce it because I heard it, and he may deny it when he feels it, and he may take it from me, but at some level he knows that's what the truth is. Trust does not take so much time, because it isn't a matter of trust in regard to non-value judgment. You see, the client quite often says, I want to trust you, meaning that you won't cause me any pain. But we can't give that kind of trust, because in many cases we have to introduce pain, because we're introducing truth, which threatens the ego of the client. You see, so that kind of trust we're never going to get, because that's not really trust, that's a form of guarantee that my ego won't have to feel any pain. I can't give any client such a guarantee in the therapy process. The only trust that the client needs is that I will not make a value judgment of whatever his experiential life is. There's no good or bad to it, which becomes very apparent early in the session.
But that's pretty significant trust. If a person has lived with a lot of value judgments in their life, and then this is the first relationship they've had where that's an understood part of the process. It may not be an understood part of the process for the client, that there will be no value judgment for the person's experience.
Right. I'm saying that's what they want is trust. I'm not suggesting that's even necessary, and there's even a part of this whole process. What they're saying is that because their acceptance of themselves is conditional upon their not seeing anything negative, they want to feel somehow you're not going to judge them negatively, because if you do, they're going to judge themselves negatively. That is not yet a therapeutic state, because they're not in a state of unconditional acceptance, where they will be open to the truth of themselves, regardless of whether it's positive or negative. What they're saying at the beginning is, I will share with you and I will listen to you and engage in this process if you're not going to value judge me, because their value judgment of themselves is not independent of other people value judging them. So if I value judge them, they're going to value judge themselves. But that's not the therapeutic state.
Okay.
The therapeutic state is when they drop conditional value judgment, conditional acceptance, and are unconditionally self-accepting of whatever the truth happens to be. I find that can happen even before they formulate that in their mind.
So all of that process leading up to that therapeutic process, though, is still part of the therapy.
Needn't be. I'm saying it needn't be.
Okay.
If the client hears the truth they've been running from, even before they've built up any trust of me, and of course the real trust is not any of that. The real trust is that I'm capable, that I know what I'm doing, so that they are not in the hands of somebody who can let them get overwhelmed and so forth. So the client comes in the very first session and talks about all kinds of things that have to do with the guilt and with her brother and so forth. Her brother got killed in the war, and how terrible this was, and how this has disturbed psychological balance. And it became very apparent that a part of her was glad that he had died. And that's not easy to accept for an individual. You see. But if I hear that, and she hears that at some level, and that becomes clear to her, and I could share that with her, even very early, apparently that, of course it hurt you when your brother died, but I get the feeling that a part of you was glad too, in a way. Because he had been a staunch competitor and robbed her of all the attention and affection she should have received, and a lot of resentment and jealousy and so many other things involved in that situation. And so she's suffering all these years. That truth was always there, unaccepted. It became very clear to me, not because I deduced it, but because it was in her, and in the state of communion it is in me. And when it's conscious in me, it becomes conscious in her. So that when I say that to her, that becomes abundantly clear that, of course, the tears come and the whole healing process, how terrible.
Suppose she rejects it and it doesn't.
She can try to, you see, but it comes so suddenly and so clearly that it is the truth, that we can't. There are some things that you see about yourself when they become conscious. You can try to block them from conscious awareness, but when they become conscious, the truth is abundantly clear. So then it's only a matter of dealing with the pain and working out the pain of that. You say, oh, how could I possibly have wanted him dead? This is a horrible thing. And then we work that process out. Yeah, but this is natural. All kids feel jealous. It doesn't mean that he died because you wanted him to. You don't have that kind of empathy.
Isn't that also part of the therapy, though?
It is, but it is the secondary part. It is not the healing part. It is the working through part. The ancillary attendant parts. The healing part is the acceptance of the painful truth that we've been rejecting all this time.
So what do you do the following week when your client comes in and says, I can't believe last week you suggested that I wanted my brother to be dead?
Yes. Didn't you hear that within yourself? Wasn't that the truth of yourself? They might say that. They usually will say that, if I'm coming from intellect to intellect, then they feel very threatened. Because they haven't felt that. They haven't seen the truth of that, experienced that of themselves, so that they think I'm trying to force this truth upon themselves, and so they will get, rightfully so, very defensive about what I'm trying to sell. That's why it's very dangerous to try to sell
That'd be a
anything.
good question to, that'd be a good time to ask the question that you posed a couple of weeks ago about what are you afraid of? Because fear is the bottom line in the therapeutic process.
Sure. Fear is always the bottom line in that. But I find that when the client hears that, then there's only the emotional working through. They stored up pain and the tears and the guilt and, oh, what a horrible thing that is. And invariably they say, a part of me loved Johnny very much, and I know that I can hear that too. Because it isn't just one-sided. We never were just one side. You may hate your father, but there's a part of you that loves him too. It's true in all respects, in all relationships. You can't really relate with somebody over the years. And not have ambivalent feelings along the way, some of which we don't recognize. Sometimes the positive ones we don't recognize. Sometimes the negative ones we don't recognize. You see. And so in some sense she's trying to convince me and herself, yeah, I loved him too. But I hear that also. I mean, that's not very difficult to hear, you see. And so a part of her is crying for the missed love that she had with him, and also for the guilt, and crying for herself. But that there's a healing effect in that, which is quite different than somebody crying as a cover-up for angry feelings. They don't want to feel their anger, so they drain out the tension of their repressed anger through tears. And there's no real hurt involved in those tears. There is rage and desire to release the pent-up tension of that rage. It's a different kind of tears. There's a healing effect in these tears because it is truth that you are accepting in that moment, and it is healing you. Whatever concomitant feelings it brings, you have to encourage those to come as well. You see. But I'm saying that revelation, that sudden revelation to the client, as it is to me, comes out of a very special therapeutic relationship, which is never discussed and probably not very well understood, which I've been writing about lately because I think it is essential and what makes therapy relatively quick in its duration. That ability to be part of the client's psyche, to bring your consciousness and your gut level over to the client, which is a great sacrifice, because you are sacrificing all sense of self. It's called a state of ecstasis, because you are standing outside yourself and you're standing in the client. I think when you do this in life in general, when you stand outside of yourself in life, you'll find that to be a very ecstatic state. Ecstatic really meaning that you're standing outside the mind-body boundary of the ego and standing immersed totally in what is outside you, which is optimal contact with reality. So this is an optimal love relationship. It is optimal contact with the client's reality. It's a state of psychological health that you are in that moment that you are relating. And it is that means to the end that produces the healthy end. You cannot be in a state of self-consciousness, which is egotistical self-awareness and duality, you see, and help the client heal his or her own state of duality or separatedness within themselves. The means and the ends are really the same process. And people don't understand this process. Or if they understand it to some degree, they can't engage in it because they have made the commitment to the gratification of their own ego self-consciousness. That is the commitment to maintain the sense of psychological separatedness upon which the ego depends for its sense of self. That we feel psychologically separated from each other. But in a true love relationship, we feel connected to each other, in which you become a part of me, I become a part of you. We're no longer feeling that disconnectedness from each other. See, I'm saying in that state, you hear essentially what the client has been rejecting. You feel it first. It becomes an awareness. Yeah.
Is there anything that you can do to facilitate that state? Is this something that happens?
Yes. Well, no, it happens, yes, but there's a lot that you can do to facilitate it. I mean, that would be the thing that we would have to discuss over time. If I had you for 2 or 3 years, that would be the thing that I would work on, you see, on your own personal growth. That enables you to undo your own egotistical self-consciousness and your whole identification with the ego, that makes you able to be empty in here and therefore totally giving over of all your awareness and all your feeling energy to the client. That's psychological health. So I'm saying that it's only our own psychological maturity that helps other people mature. It's only our own psychological health that enables the client to become healthy. And that it's not a technique. Techniques take time. I'm saying the process of psychotherapy is a timeless thing. So the therapeutic effect itself takes place in timelessness. That's a much more complicated thing to say than to explain without the fundamental background that I would have to share with you in order for you to understand fundamentally why we are not separated psychologically. You see, why we seem, on the radius, this is the center on the circumference as bodies, we feel separated from each other. And when we have self-concepts and self-consciousness, we feel separate on the radius too. But in the center, we are all related. And when there's no self-consciousness, we are in that center where we are all related to each other. Like, individual waves of the ocean, we are all related to each other because we're related to the same water substance that unifies us. We are related to the same life energy that unifies all life forms. You feel that in the center. You can't feel that on the circumference and on the radius. So that you build your own psychological body out of self-concepts and conscious and subconscious, and positive and negative, and willfulness, and all the things that the ego is involved with, so you feel separate on the radius also. And the ego lives totally on this level, the radius and the circumference, never in the center. In the center is where your real self is, your real individuality, and your real life substance.
How do you fit transference into this?
Well, it's not very difficult. Transference will take place under any circumstance. Probably takes place a little more, for some cases more difficult here or less difficult here. Remember, you are pretty much a non-personal being in that therapy. Therefore, for some clients, it makes it easier for them to project onto you what they want you to be. You see. In other cases, if you are a certain kind of personality, it makes it easier for the client to project onto you. So that if I'm a hostile, aggressive guy to begin with, and she or he has a negative transference in regard to hostility, it's easier to project that onto me. Whereas if I'm being just like an empty mirror, so to speak, it's difficult to find justification for that because she doesn't see it. But I find that clients will project whatever is within them, because whatever is within them is seeking integration, is seeking drainage. Therefore, it will get hold of whatever individual is nearby, and it is not a conscious, willful process. Automatically, the client, or anybody else for that matter, will project onto you whatsoever they have unresolved in themselves. So if you're in a love relationship and your boyfriend or your girlfriend hasn't resolved things with their own parents, you're going to catch it. Whether you want to or not, whether you think it's reasonable or not, whether they want to or not, those feelings being unresolved naturally seek drainage so that you can be restored again to your unitary wholeness condition, which is your natural condition. Therefore, whatever you have rejected, angry feelings to your parents, feelings of being unwanted, unvalued, unloved, whatever is there and undealt with will get projected onto this new person. Therefore, we are involved in the same countertransference with our clients. Because of our own unresolved stuff, they not only are projecting onto us their need for love from us, their need to see us as perfect beings, and our own needs making ourselves believe that, and also their need to see us in a hostile manner or to manipulate us because they've been manipulated by power figures. And then we feel sensitive to that manipulation because we feel weak. If we're manipulated, then we get hostile back at the client, and we have our own countertransference feelings. Then you have the blind leading the blind, and they're both going to fall in the ditch for sure because they're all involved in their own transference and not aware of what they're doing. And then the hostility between the client and the therapist becomes very great, as each is involved in a power struggle, battle of wills, or whatever. They need to be the stronger one, they need to hurt the other one. And, well, there's no therapy going on. One has to be clean. If you're not clean, you will have transference, or what's called countertransference that comes from the therapist to the client. Because whatever is somehow rejected in you, it's not acceptable to yourself, but somehow sooner or later be triggered by the client, come up to you, and therefore because it's threatening to you, you will somehow either not hear it in the client or reject it in the client. How can it be otherwise? That's the danger, you see, in getting involved in therapy relationships before we are reasonably clean.
You and I had a conversation once about not identifying with your own personal reaction to what happens in the therapy, and that's sort of at this stage of the game, that's sort of the best that you can do until you've worked out that. That's
right, but you're still reacting. You see that, and in your reaction taking place here, your consciousness has recoiled back upon yourself, and you've lost the contact with the client. You don't know how much you've missed, and I don't mean just missed up here in terms of the verbalization, but how many feelings have passed you by, related feelings. You can't get that back. It's like a river that's flowing, and once it's flowed, it's flowed. It's gone. So flow on, river of life. But quite often clients give us another crack at it. So because they haven't resolved it, they'll probably come around again, and maybe many times around, until they realize sooner or later that we're not going to hear it. Something else is blocking, we are not going to hear it. Because to hear it in them would be to hear it in ourselves, and we have a commitment not to hear it.
So what do you do given that? I mean, if you know you're stuck on something yourself, and you have a sense that the client keeps coming up with his own particular thing, is your ethical commitment to say, I can't work with you, I need to refer you elsewhere? Or?
Well, you may need somebody to consult with to get a more objective view as to what element of non-constructiveness that is taking place in the therapy. It may not have very significant effect, or it may have a very, very significant effect. Or you're rejecting the client, maybe the thing you really are after doing, which may be the most non-constructive thing you can do, because you're trying to punish, reject, abandon, but you know it's going to hurt a lot, whatever. All that has to be examined. Quite often, even though you're an experienced therapist, on the part of somebody else having an objective view of all that. But your responsibility is to heal yourself first, through a state of communion within yourself, between conscious awareness and subconscious feelings, in which there's a state of communion between the conscious awareness and the feelings, and then you find suddenly these feelings springing up into conscious awareness in the same way as I discussed it here, in the growth part. So if you believe in growth, you must do that. If you don't believe in growth, what are you doing in therapy? Being a therapist. Then if you don't believe in growth, then all you're involved with is modification, change. But within the same level of maturational functioning, the client has always functioned at, and the same is true for yourself. You may learn to contain your anger a lot more. You may learn to contain your authority problems a lot more, willfulness a lot more. But you haven't really changed in the sense that you operate at a maturational level that's more mature than you have previously operated, because your fixations that are immature have been outgrown and resolved. They're still there, you're still immature. So, physician, heal thyself first. That should be the first order of business in training any therapist, I think, is to teach them the process of their own self-healing, And so in the 2 or 3 years or 4 years of their training, they have plenty of time to go through 4 years of their own therapy. Then, even though they haven't worked out everything, they understand the process of growth, and they're ready to do a decent job. At least to be open enough that when they are reacting, they don't project that out and make that a counter-transference situation. But take some responsibility that they are reacting, and they're not really able to accept the client because of that reaction or hear the client, then they have to decide to transfer the client onto somebody else or to work with somebody around this issue so this can be drained out so they can work with this client. In some cases you can, in some cases you can't. So I had a good friend of mine who called me up once and said he's really struggling because he's the kind of the humanistic psychologist, therapist, who believes that you can love everybody. You know. So it was very difficult for him to work with this elderly man who came in because it became to him a kind of father-son thing. And he wanted to be the authority. He didn't like, in a sense, being the younger one, having the older person treat him like a child and all that other business. And, he became hostile to the client, and that shattered him. He believed that he was all love. When he saw his own hostility, he said, my whole career is over. Because my whole career is based upon my belief that I can love every patient that comes in. There's something therapeutic about that love. That's the therapeutic ingredient. And he said, I saw my hostility, my rage even, my contempt for this older person. I wanted to hurt this older person. Obviously, this person is too much like father. He's never resolved things with father. And I can't love this client. I want to reject this client. I want to hurt the client. But if I dismiss the client, I'll be indulging that need to hurt. If I don't dismiss the client, I might end up hurting the client anyway. Help, what should I do? So we get involved in that kind of situation very often. Our limiting factor is not how many years of schooling we have. Our limiting factor is the degree to which we have our own repressed pathology that we haven't healed. That's the limiting factor in not being a therapist. But ultimately, if you want therapy to be very quick, as it can be within yourself and between yourself and another, as it can be between yourself, not just and another client, but between yourself and any loved one, because this is a love relationship, the state of communion. This is an optimal relationship. And if you're going to communicate with anybody that you love, to really communicate with a partner, you have to be in a state of communion with that person, so that you can really hear and understand what's going on in your partner, and not value, judge, and condemn. Because when you hear it at that level, you not only hear what the client or your partner is feeling, you hear why they're feeling it. You have an understanding. From the understanding comes a compassion and a forgiveness, even though they're being rejecting of you and hostile toward you and whatever. So if you're going to make even a personal relationship work, communication has to be there, which requires a state of communion between the two of you. Otherwise, you're only communicating words and not meaning or feelings, which is not real communication, which is verbal interaction. Therefore, there's no psychological intimacy between the two of you, no psychological connectedness. And if there's no psychological connectedness, then you're not like the two hot coals I mentioned once, I think, and then burst out into flame, enveloping both individuals, which is something grander than the ego can have within itself. That loving feeling that embraces both, when there's real communion and connection, is a thing at the center, the transpersonal element. It's not a personal part of your ego. You can't produce a loving feeling by conscious willful effort, no matter how hard you try. And you can't produce it just by listening and listening and listening and caring. There has to be that contact between the two of you. And then this happens spontaneously. And this is very grand. Those of you that have had that experience know that it's inseparable from very great joy. It is transpersonal, otherworldly.
Are there people for whom therapy is not effective or not useful, or that just won't go anywhere?
Not usually, unless the person just can't communicate, isn't bright enough, intelligent enough to be able to communicate. But even then, I would say, even with psychotics, gross psychotics, communion, they can't keep me out. That's the important thing. They can't keep me out. So if I'm with a psychotic who's terribly regressed and nonverbal, you see, I can still be with the client really be with the client, my awareness and my gut feelings are going totally to the client, I can still hear some things going on in there, and I will say them. And I will make contact with the client inside. They may continue to reject me for a while, without doubt, but at some level they're listening. So when I say to them, I can feel how cold and scared you feel inside, because that feeling comes to me. I'm in a state of communion. Whenever there's contraction, there's coldness. And whenever there's coldness, there's fear. This kind of cold weather does the same thing to us because we don't realize it. Ordinarily, when you contract, when you escape from something, you feel tension. In that contraction, you feel coldness, you feel fear. And many times when the weather gets cold, we tend to contract in the same way, producing fear. We don't even know why we're so fearful when the cold weather comes. So why we're so tense inside. But if I hear that experiential state in the client, he may or she may not look at me even. But at some level, when I'm in a state of communion, I know that it is registering because I can't feel it unless they're feeling it too. On some level, they have felt it, and I've been in communion with them, and I have felt it, and I have heard it, and I have shared it. And I may share something in addition to the fact that if they wish, I can help them to drain that out. They'll share that with me as best they can consciously. So in the first few sessions, quite often they're still, in that state, where they won't even acknowledge my existence. They turn their back to me, and they're still humming their little tune and making their little gyrations with their hands and everything. It makes no difference. You have to tune in. That's the sacrifice of caring, you see. In caring, you put yourself aside totally, and that other person becomes you. That other person becomes your whole world. You're not aware of you at all. That's what communion means. That's why we're able to be connected. We're able to give our awareness and our gut energy totally over to the other, so the other lives in us this moment, instead of our own subjectivity living in us that moment. So the two of us are one. That's a love relationship. That love relationship heals. I don't care how sick the person is. That love relationship heals. And I'm saying it heals irrespective of whatever I share. The energy of my awareness and the energy of my gut level penetrating into this individual, making a contact there, which they feel at some level, even if I didn't say anything, will start to produce a contact with that reality, and ultimately a contact with me as reality, and ultimately coming out into this reality. Love is the healing ingredient, all of life. Even physically, when you reject certain sensations within yourself, psychologically you reject certain feelings, and you're in a state of unlove, you're not a unified whole. Only that unification, which is a love relationship, is the healing ingredient. That's why you never want to destroy anything in yourself. That's the people who are teaching visualization will tell you to visualize your cancer and destroy it. So it's the worst thing you can do because you already have the cancer because you're attacking yourself. I say in some cases it can be effective if you believe that visualization. But a more astounding effect takes place when you love, when you unify without cancer. And you realize that something in you is hurting real bad, and you've been rejecting it all your life. And so to attack it now, will only hasten the increase of the cancer. You've got to listen to it lovingly because it's a part of you. Saying, I can't take this hurt that I've experienced all my life, this rejection, it's like a father who wants to die to punish all these people for what they've done to me. Client will hear that in a loving state. Why? Because all of life is a unified whole, and in that unified wholeness, love is the natural state, as the natural feeling, because everything is connected to everything else in that wholeness. So I'm telling you that connection, psychological connection, is the reality. Egotistical sense of separatedness is unnatural, created by self-conceptualization and therefore self-consciousness through that process. It is unnatural, although it is most prevalent in our world. So the relationship, the communion relationship, is the means and the end. The healing effect, the loving communion between the two individuals. So I'm saying that nobody can escape me, or you, or anybody, it's not just me. They cannot escape you if you are loving enough, meaning if you have really given away all that you are and are giving your total conscious awareness and your total feeling energy, or what I call cathexis, investment, totally in the gut level of the client. You will hear what is there. Nobody can keep you out. Even if they're not talking to you, they can't keep you out. because there is no division between you. And you'll see that right away. Once you're tuned into somebody who is a regressed psychotic and they're not talking to you, and you're not even looking at them, because to look at them is to be distracted. Because then you're looking at gestures, and by turning your own eyes away, you are just hearing. Your awareness has gone to your gut level, and you're hearing and you're feeling what's going on in the other individual. And then you will realize there's no boundary between you. That love is the natural state between every living thing. That's why even plants and animals, the contact, the touch, even like physical touch. We have egotistically done something unnatural in separating ourselves from others. That's the whole ego sense. The ego sense is a finite, separated sense. The attempt to prove to yourself that psychologically speaking, you're as finite and separated as your physical body is. So you build a psychological body as ego to correspond to your physical body, which is your sense of self. It's not your real self. That keeps you caged in, fenced in, and feeling separate from the whole of life. Like a wave, feeling fenced in, with ice barrier, feeling separated from the whole ocean in which its whole substance is made. Once you come out of that fence, once you're in a state of ecstasis, then you have discovered the whole meaning of psychological happiness, unconditioned happiness. It has nothing to do with what conditions you get. The natural state of living, which is ecstatic, living outside yourself in life, and you feel you're one with the whole expanse. We can't live that way every moment because we must often communicate with each other, which means I must stand separated from you and get verbally into all kinds of things. But it's possible for us to live this way when it is necessary for us to live this way. In our own state of healing. Well, to me, it's totally irrelevant because it doesn't say anything for the process of therapy. For beginning therapists, it teaches them a little something about how, what kind of things to look for. It's valuable. So, a person is psychotic, they should know that because it means that their ego is very weak, that they're very frightened of relationship because they have to preserve what little sense of self they have. They're frightened of pain, they're frightened of being hurt. There's some things you can do at the very beginning with those kinds of clients that beginning students can't do, but you might be able to do if you have a little more experience and more understanding. So the diagnosis is not an essential element of the therapy process, but for many individuals it becomes a helpful thing because it gives you something to look for. If you're an experienced therapist, it's a disturbing thing, because you should have nothing to look for. If you look for something, then you are already set in what you want to perceive. And if you have a set in what you want to perceive, then what the client is feeling often goes over your head because you will perceive what you have a set to perceive. And therefore gives you a commitment, which is not good therapy. You should be uncommitted and seeing what comes to you. So if I have a readiness to see sexual problems in you, I kind of disregard everything else you're talking about, and I'm waiting for you to disclose the sexual problem because that's what I believe is fundamental. And that's what I listen to and that's what I hear. But in the meantime, a lot of other things are going over my head. I register them as insignificant.
So you don't even need an evaluation.
Yes, whether I need an evaluation? I don't need an evaluation, no. Evaluation of what? I'm doing that, really, in the first session. Does be formal in terms of Rorschach and so forth. I'm not saying it's not helpful in certain cases, where the client is, really torn between something repressed, like, for example, a hysterical disorder like paralyzed arm, and they don't, they can't share with you anything related to that because they are completely oblivious to what's related to that. So in some cases, it might help you to be aware of what that paralyzed arm signifies. But still, you can't deliver that intellectually. You'd love to find a way to make that alive in the client through your exploration. That becomes alive, and you hear it. It becomes delivered up to the conscious awareness of the client, and he hears it. Then he will hear maybe his own repressed hostility, his own rage, and the guilt around hurting somebody and have to punish himself or whatever may be involved in that. An intellectual sharing, a cognitive understanding alone, does not have any therapeutic value because it doesn't heal the duality or sense of separatedness between the feeling that you have rejected and your conscious awareness, and therefore has therapeutic value in itself. Interpretation doesn't heal unless the interpretation helps bring this up to conscious awareness, then it can be a prelude to hearing. What I'm saying is when it brings up a feeling to conscious awareness, then whatever insight is inside the feeling, then insight or understanding comes after the effect of therapy. First is the healing effect of the coming together with the repressed feeling of anger. Then the anger will speak and drain out what I'm so angry about and so forth. Then the insight will come consequent to therapy. Insight doesn't precede therapy, it comes consequent to therapy. First comes the uniting healing effect between whatever feeling you have rejected. Then the message inside the feeling, once the feeling is accepted, the message inside the feeling will flow spontaneously to conscious awareness, and the insight will be there.
A lot of times you'll describe what will happen in therapy, and you'll sort of put the client's words in certain terms that the clients never ever say. And
Like what words?
oh, that the client will say, oh, I was so afraid of my father, I thought I was going to die. And clients very rarely say that. They usually end up talking about, this, that, and the other thing. And
Sure.
I just have a hard time sort of putting it in my terms, or putting it, and you would say, well, there's no need to put it in my terms. The client has their own terms. But I don't know. I just have a hard time getting the client to say whatever it is that makes it a therapeutic process versus sort of just a dialogue.
That's right. And that's the difference between the mind communicating, because the conscious mind might not communicate that way, but the gut level of the client might communicate that way. The conscious mind wouldn't think in terms of I'm going to die, but the gut level is experiencing that my father treats me in a certain way, that it means death to me. It's an experiential truth, even though it isn't a logical, cognitive truth. So he would never use that language up here.
Yeah.
But remember, he's functioning at two levels. He is using that language here. That may be the language I'm hearing. So I respond to the language that I'm hearing. You see. So he may say, how am I going to die? I don't see how I'm going to die. We may explore that, and then he'll be able to see experientially if the feeling comes up.
And how do you explore it? Because it then just becomes a convincing thing. Well,
You've got to listen to his feeling, because as I say, the insight is inside the feeling. The insight will come if he just communes or unifies with the feeling. Then the feeling will give its own message. My truth is not his truth. His truth is the message inside the feeling, which itself becomes released when he unifies with the feeling and accepts it unconditionally.
I think clients need to use their own language because that's what their feelings are connected to.
Yeah.
And I have a client who's been to AA, and AA is what he's been to, and maybe Al-Anon or ACOA too, but
Sure.
he's a recovering alcoholic. And he uses all these words that he learned, and how there's absolutely no connection to his feelings at all.
Sure.
But he can sit there and tell me all this information that he got through AA, all this language that he learned. But there's no feeling connected to it.
Feeling has its own language, and it may speak for you in your own particular way. I might translate it in terms of how I would, and maybe the words would not be as good as the words that he would communicate it in, but the message is basically the same in terms of the effects. So if I say he's going to die, or if I say he's going to be abandoned, he might not use the word abandoned, he might use rejected, or left all alone, or whatever it might be. He might use those terms, but it amounts to pretty much the same thing. Meaning that if I'm all alone, I'm going to die. I can't survive if I'm all alone. That's how the feeling feels it.
And sometimes if you give them a word that's like abandon, that's your word, not their word, then they can reject the feeling because, well, abandon, that's a little too strong.
That's right. It doesn't
It's not
register
word
for me,
yeah.
abandoned, sure.
But somehow you have to guide them along so that they're what's happening at the gut level becomes conscious in a way that they can understand it.
That's right.
And if they don't have the words because they haven't experienced it consciously, then I don't know where the words come from.
Up here they don't have the words. It comes from the feeling itself. The thing you have going for you in therapy is that whatever is rejected wants to come up, because it's unnatural to divide what is a unitary whole. Your being is not a unitary whole that includes these feelings plus these opposite thoughts and feelings. It's a whole that is transcendent of both of these. It's a unitary whole. It's a wholeness which is empty of all concepts of oneself. It is not the negative plus the positive together. Not that kind of totality as a whole. So because this is your natural state, because being is an indivisible whole, it naturally wants to restore itself to the state of indivisible unitary wholeness. Therefore, whatever you have caused as division naturally pushes very hard to come up to conscious awareness so it can speak and drain out. And it pushes just as hard to communicate to somebody else. So when the client puts their arms around you, I mean, that's a behavior, but they're also communicating something feeling-wise. They say, I've got to have a hug this moment, as the client in the case conference did last week. I've got to have a hug. You say, otherwise what? What's going to happen if I don't give you a hug? But you see, the feelings are coming because the feelings want to drain. Something within us always wants to be restored to our original and natural condition of being a unitary whole, because that's our happiness. That's the inherent happiness of our real being. That's the reality of us. The reality always pushes to restore itself. Therefore, if you just try to help the person have a more positive self-concept, oh, it's time for us to go. Oh, yes, it's okay, we're just about done. And you maintain this division, only it's a more positive division, then there is no maturational effect, there is no healing effect. Yeah,
Back in the doors down there.
Getting reminders on both sides.
Yeah. Okay, so shall we let it go then for the rest of the semester? And let it decide?
I don't know what I'm going to do though Monday morning. At 0 degrees when I have to go out and start the car.
I know. Well, if any of you want to drop in and just chat about anything around therapy, you can feel free to do that. Always make the time to do that.
Can we do this again next semester?
If there's enough people interested, I'll share whatever you want. Sure?
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Can we get enough people interested?
Hard to say.
How can
Who's around?
You're going to be here, aren't you?
Looks like it.